Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I didn't even watch all of the Super Bowl. Why am I going to watch the second impeachment? I mean, I think many people feel this way. If it's not must see TV, then it's must not see TV. And even, the big ritualistic American TV events are losing their juice.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast, here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. I'm joined, we have him back in action, by Matthew Peterson, vice president of education, founding editor of the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind, and for his second week in a row, many more to come, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. Well, gents, I thought today it's day 3 of impeachment. Or is it 2? I don't know. It's all running together. It doesn't matter. Nobody's watching it. No one cares. It's a giant show trial. I just wanted to flag a few data points and then we can riff away. I just did this brief piece for our Substack today. And as these things go, it's not a fully developed argument because you just do it in 600-700 words to raise a few issues and get some juices flowing. But it just seems to me to be pretty imprudent, even from the Never Trump Republicans, to be backing this farce. Our friends, John Yoo and Robert Delahunty, Robert, a Washington fellow at our new DC Center for the American Way of Life, which we'll announce next Tuesday formally, including we might even have Arthur Millick on a couple of these programs, our executive director. Delahunty and you say the deck is stacked against Trump. The House rushed it through. They didn't really marshal half the evidence they would have, or they couldn't really. Evidence is still being gathered about the what Seth has called the farce of, in many ways, of January 6th, this ridiculous scrum at the Capitol, which we don't want to downplay any injuries that were caused or property that was broken, but it really was nothing like a real coup or an insurrection. They haven't marshaled all the evidence because it's not out there. The Senate is going to try this thing under current Senate rules. The Senate, they'd have to change their procedures for impeachment if they wanted to fill in for where the House fell short with witnesses and all the rest. Trump no longer has the benefit of the Office of Legal Counsel, so he's had to cobble together what looks so far to be somewhat incompetent representation in the Senate trial. The whole thing is kind of nuts. And my macro point was, I think even the Never Trump Republicans think somehow if they can get a conviction in the Senate and then bar Trump from further office, he'll go quietly into that good night and we can all get on with politics as normal. But 5 million people just voted for him for president not too long ago. A good solid 40% of the Republican Party presumptively views any anti-Trump sentiment on the Never Trump right or on the Democrat left as just dishonest or opportunistic or both. So I think given the crazy high temperature quality of our politics right now, it just seems to me to be crazy to think that an impeachment of whatever resolution at this point with Trump out of office, when he's no longer even an officer of the United States, to take the language from the impeachment clause, how can this do any good for our politics?
It's my singular pleasure to have watched none of the impeachment trial. I'm pretty sure most of us are in the same boat. And as we were saying off mic, we're all the better for it. And I really do think that that's kind of true. It's the sort of thing that watching it like sucks information and sense out of your brain rather than giving you a new perspective or information. My favorite thing to emerge out of it so far is this tweet by Andrea Mitchell, who is an NBC chief Washington correspondent. And she says, at Senator Ted Cruz says, #impeachment trial is like Shakespeare, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. no, that's Faulkner. Now, of course, Faulkner wrote a novel called The Sound and the Fury, which was referring to the quote from Macbeth, in which he says that life is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And
out, brief candle.
Out. Yeah, exactly. What's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty impeachment. And what's really like too perfect about this is that Mitchell is exemplifying exactly what Cruz is responding to, which is just the utter inanity and emptiness of this. It's kind of the height thus far, I think, of the clown world phenomenon that we've been observing. This sense of emptiness and carnival to all of our supposedly highest institutions and offices. And I think like that is, to me, the most significant thing about it is just how empty it really is. And we talked last week about some of the ways in which that might play out. It feels like the dying gasp of a deeply unreal and unserious leadership class.
Well, this is like when they kicked Roseanne off Roseanne. I mean, the Trump show really sucks without Trump in it. I didn't even watch all of the Super Bowl. Why am I going to watch the second impeachment? I mean, I think many people feel this way. If it's not must see TV, then it's must not see TV. And even the big ritualistic American TV events are losing their juice. People are much more excited to look at phone footage of Tom Brady like staggering drunkenly past the press corps as a minder like holds him by the biceps and like maneuvers him along the crowd. They'd much rather watch a drunken Tom Brady throwing the Super Bowl trophy across from one motorboat to another where Gronk is waiting to receive it. That is far more entertaining than watching like Tampa Bay just rack up touchdown after like soul-sapping touchdown against what until Super Bowl Sunday was like a very well-regarded and quite active football team and was just humiliated and paralyzed. People get enough humiliation and paralysis out of their own lives. They don't need to see that on TV. And I think, people who have been on every side of the Trump saga are cognizant of the fact that, that what's really interesting and what's really important is not happening on screen, certainly not on the big screen.
That was a nice transition, James, to the Super Bowl from the impeachment saga.
If only they'd done the second impeachment before the Super Bowl, they might actually have gotten people to care.
Well, I mean, even the first impeachment was a complete bust. I mean, it too. The outcome was foreordained. Everyone knew that they were not going to win. And the funny thing is, do people even remember what like the subject matter of the first impeachment was? It was so absurd and so trivial that it could only be of importance to people like Andrea Mitchell or Washington insiders who think that, minutia about White House phone calls or various things are important or matter to anyone. And this just seems like this impeachment, it's just so weird that they're doubling down on this as a strategy. And apparently they think that this is going to like really inflame America to be reminded of all the savagery of January 6th. It seems unlikely that most people have some kind of emotional response to it. I just want to point out, of course, Andrea Mitchell is married to Alan Greenspan, which always struck me as like a really perverse coupling. And that Alan Greenspan, of course, was a acolyte of Ayn Rand, but then went on to run a central bank. So,
yeah,
the whole perversity and contradictions and, poor reading skills, I think are on display here for that couple.
Yeah, there's that first impeachment, Seth. I think it was roundabout when we were beginning this podcast, one of our earliest podcasts. We were talking about the obscurity, the strangeness of the Ukraine kerfuffle, the weakness of the case. And I think you're hitting on what has always struck me as kind of most grotesque about really both of these. I mean, this case is flimsier even than Ukraine, I think. The idea, and Charles Kessler actually has a really good essay that's online already on Claremont Review Books called After January 6th about, the inadequacy of the case. But back then I was sort of rifling through my Federalist Papers as a good Claremonster does, thinking about impeachment. And the kind of big one is 65, where Hamilton gives justification for vesting the power of trial in the Senate. And the reason is, he says, this is because this is a suit brought by the representatives of the people against an individual. So it's supposed to be like our case against this person. It's supposed to be, the way in which we have been offended and our trust has been violated. And we have these representatives who are there essentially to prosecute that case on our behalf. And the Senate is supposed to be here adjudicating that dispute. Now, I recognize that referring to the founding documents and the Federalist Papers as a roadmap for how our government is actually supposed to operate in action may be just fantastically naive at this point. Nevertheless, it's pretty galling to see this whole thing hijacked, as so many of the major dimensions of our public life have been hijacked by, these minute provincial interest groups with really arcane concerns having mostly to do with their own personal vendettas and their career advancement. And even, frankly, the Republicans, who are obviously at least sort of fighting our corner marginally in this, are also, I don't particularly think, invested in the high principle of defending the cause of the people against some sort of threat of tyranny. So there's a deep frustration there if you let yourself peer into it too long.
I'm shocked at all of you. There's literally an insurrection against the United States government. There was a desecration of the most sacred place in America, and you all act like this is some random thing. I mean, I don't understand. I really don't get it. I mean, an insurrection against the United States of America. You're supposed to be conservatives. You're supposed to care about our government and our form of government. And instead, you are fine with the president of the United States trying to destroy democracy and encouraging Americans, traitors, insurrectionists, to desecrate the most sacred spot in all of Washington, D.C. And frankly, you're ignoring the most dangerous threat America faces, which is, of course, the threat of white supremacy and terrorism. That's really, it's all across the country. I mean, 50 state capitals were in jeopardy. There are thousands of troops in Washington, D.C. So I don't know what any of you are talking about. And I'm really concerned for the fate of our country.
Well, Matt, honestly, as Faulkner once said, you do protest too much.
So we all thought Matt would get, breathe the free air of Dallas, Texas, and get more based. But turns out, it's a reverse effect. What happened, Matt?
It's crazy. I've turned. No, it is amazing to be in America again. In all seriousness, it's been great to be here. You feel, it's just a really weird feeling to be in a place where the government isn't actively trying to destroy you and your family. Maybe even sometimes trying to defend it. It's a strange feeling. I get a little warm and fuzzy every so often driving around here.
Matt, you and I escaped it just under the gun. We're like the last people to be allowed to travel from state to state. Have you seen that Biden is now kind of musing about shutting it all down? As in fact, I think you and I discussed on Tell Me What You Really Think a while back. Are they going to try and clamp this down? And Ryan was telling me he doesn't think it's even remotely possible to actually do, but it's still funny that it's we're the last people to escape.
No, they don't want. I mean, right? This is the whole thing we talk about with social media. I mean, they don't want us to talk to each other. They don't want this migration to actually continue, and they're very concerned about it. And I will say, in Dallas, you can certainly tell, and it's not just Dallas, there's a number of other places throughout the country where this is happening, but predominantly Texas and Florida, with a nod to Nashville. From what I can see, I mean, those are just the centers of gravity because they're the largest planets out there. they gravitate. They just everything moves towards them. But you see something very interesting happening where everyone you talk to, right, knows migrants who come in. And I'm, of course, is self-selecting. I'm not saying what the ultimate statistics are for the great domestic migration that's happening throughout the country that no one is talking about. But certainly in more right-leaning or Christian circles, you could say Catholic circles, you just see this confluence. I mean, there's this momentum right now, and it's very real. And I have to say, I would be even maybe somewhat hopeful, despite the fact that you guys don't care about democracy and don't want to save it. I would be somewhat hopeful about the results of this, because you really have people from mostly blue cities, coastal cities, moving to these places in droves. And regardless of what the statistics are ultimately, this is a lot of talent being concentrated in small areas. And that's going to bear fruit. It really is. There's no way around that. And I can see this not just here, just because we communicate with a lot of people throughout the country. You can really see this gathering happening. And I think there's a lot of energy in the country right now among people who already knew that things were very, very bad. And now they're building things, they're doing stuff. It's quiet, it's in the background. But I'm actually bullish about the battles that are coming, and the creative explosion. What's this going to look like over the course of the next few years, as kind of everything contracts and galvanizes and consolidates, and people quietly, just start putting their head down and making new stuff, new things.
Yeah,
I'm crazy, and you just caught me after a good good bottle of wine. But I think I think this is actually happening, and we're going to see some fruits.
I'm having a similar experience, Matt, over here in Nashville, and I think you're right that the real loci of this are Texas and Florida, but Nashville is definitely the third city people mention on that list. And there's an aspect of it that makes me particularly hopeful, which is really an aspect having to do with realignment. Madison at some point in defense of the Republican Party, I think, said that he was interested in erasing every distinction but that between friends and enemies of the Republic. And you do kind of see deplorables of all stripes are suddenly recognizing each other as maybe closer in values than they had thought they had been. And it crosses things like class and origin. I am this country, I am a city boy moving to the country. And there's always been a sense in my mind that this was true, but now it's really, it's made actual that I have more in common with a farmer in rural Tennessee than I have with an urbanite in Los Angeles. And that breakdown of distinctions is happening on every possible level. It happened racially a little bit in 2020. It will continue to happen, especially as we've just published on the site. It'll continue to happen, especially along the breakdown between white Hispanics will cease to matter quite so much. And there is a sense in which when you're forced to flee for refuge into the same place, you suddenly realize that we have these very essential things in common, and you can build from there, which is exciting.
But what about, not to dash everyone's expectations, but what about the contrary argument, which is that California is just bleeding its dysfunction into functional states? Look at Colorado, Arizona, Nevada. These were all red states at one point, not that long ago, which have gone either purple or just full blue. And this is what some people are seeing as the future of Texas, say. Do you guys see that as something to worry about?
So I think this is the problem with this debate is we don't actually have the data we need, I don't think. So what you say is true generally about those states turning purplish or even blue. At the same time, Texas was blue for many, many decades. Texas was Democrat, back in the day, and it turned actually red more recently. So this narrative about the blue locusts coming and destroying these other states there's certainly truth to it, but how much truth, I don't know. I'm actually, if anyone out there has an extra $25K, I already have some of this funding from organizations in Texas, but we're going to do an extensive survey of people coming to Texas, particularly Californians, and look at who they are and why they're moving here. And Seth, the interesting thing is that the data point that people will give to the contrary is that Beta lost because transplants actually voted against him 5 or 6 points, and the other way from residents who were much more democratic. So it's not clear. I mean, so certainly a place like Texas, if you're moving here from California, you could move anywhere, right? Why are you coming to Texas? If it's purely economic and maybe you have connections here, ethnically or family-wise, whatever, okay. But where are you going to move and why? And I would say that especially in the last 9 months, this is not just an economic migration. I mean, that's been going on for a while, right? Austin has been growing like crazy for 10, 20 years. Has Texas been getting more blue? I don't know, looked pretty good this time around. There a lot of money came in. Cruz is kind of unpopular. He still won. So I just think you're not wrong. I think especially what we'd worry about is what our friend Dave Raboy talks about. He's worried about Florida. If you bring in big tech money and power from, say, Silicon Valley, that is going to have an influence on the state, probably in the wrong direction. But I don't think we actually have the data we need to make these determinations. I do think, however, the worry or the objection you present is very, very serious and something that, in fact, people in Texas and Florida should be thinking about every day.
It might be a race too, right, between those two things. I mean, I think, Matt, you have identified, it is remarkable when you stop and think about it. It's par for the course now because we're used to a media that studiously ignores the most significant things going on, especially if they don't conform to their preconceptions. But it is astonishing that this massive sociological trend is occurring. And we're sitting around here and be there ought to be a social science study of this. Somebody ought to do some research. And it's nobody, crickets. And so that's astonishing. But I do think that once we know that information, it will be a long way to understanding how to consolidate this movement, because Seth, what you're saying, and it's a big portion also of Michael Anton's new book is absolutely a factor. It's not happening. That's for sure. Especially just the sort of weird creep of these progressive policies that tend to sort of sweep outward from the cities. It's just that as in so many cases, we weirdly, the power and the funding to actually investigate it in an original and deeply sourced way is sort of not to be found.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it crazy? We have right now, again, this is one of the biggest stories of the year. Right. We have an insane amount of domestic migration, people moving the hell out, and we're not talking about it at all. And so what I would say is, again, this is not just economics. These are people who are moving because of the schools, because of what's going on with the schools and the virus. These are people who are moving because they've seen that their state won't protect them in terms of violence and the riots. And so, these objections are valid, but something is happening now. We don't really know what it is because there's not a spotlight being shown on it. We don't have the data points. And I'll say, in terms of Texas, so people will say here, which I find hilarious, well, Austin is like California light. And first, 50% of that I like. What do you mean by that, right? Well, it has good food. Fantastic. That's awful. It has good food like California. That's terrible. Why would anyone want to move there? Well, it's kind of liberal. And of course, the difference is that Austin, compared to any of these larger urban areas, is still small. And within 15 minutes, you're in a little red town where everyone is voting Republican. So yeah, you have the downtown, and they're importing the same policies, which is true. They're importing insane policies to places like Austin. But in Austin, the governor and the surrounding authorities, just like in Dallas, have said, you're not going to pull this crap off without us sending the state or the county, law enforcement in there. And if you defund, we're going to come after you. And so it's true that you see these movements in the wrong directions in a state like, say, Texas, but you also see even a governor like Abbott, who seemed too moderate, now almost trying to compete with DeSantis in terms of his policy against defunding the police, et cetera. And certainly, if you look at the numbers you saw in the last election in Texas, I mean, they did a very good job in securing the election results and going after and opposing the other side. So I think the jury is out. I think we really need to talk about this more, and we need real journalism poking into the ins and outs, because it's a complicated story, whatever the hell is going on. And I have my suspicions as to what's going on, but the main problem is this is really, really important. I mean, the fate of America in some sense is tied up with where people with talent and ambition are moving and what they're thinking about in terms of states and the federal government. And we're just, we're kind of flying blind.
Seth, are people just anecdotally, or people of your acquaintance fleeing New York as well? Because we're mostly talking here, I guess, about California flight.
To some extent. I mean, one friend of mine moved to Rhode Island, which seemed like an odd place to go, but I think he just wanted, to get a house. But yeah, I mean, you do hear about it, but this is something that's been happening in New York for a long time. New York has a greater population loss than any other state over the last 20 years, percentage-wise. I could be wrong about that, but particularly upstate. I mean, New York City's done all right, but the rest of the state is miserable. And, the reaction from elites here is kind of like, well, we're glad they're good. That'll leave more for us. Good. The real New Yorkers are going to stay behind. But of course, at the same time, Cuomo and de Blasio, basically the Democrats now have a supermajority in the legislature, and they're planning like heavy tax increases. I think they're going to, it's just going to accelerate the process. I mean, anyone who can afford to will leave, or a lot of people will if they want to.
But Seth, don't you think? I mean, just can you speak to the last 9 months? I mean, because it does seem. I mean, I was just there with my family during the holiday season, and I mean, it was kind of crowded, but it was really nice because you could walk around without all the usual crowds. But I mean, clearly that New York is changed its character, or a hell of a lot of people are out of there in the last 9 months, right?
People have left. I don't know if it's clear that they've left permanently.
Right.
I think that remains to be seen. I mean, certainly Midtown and like the Central Business District is empty, just with people, working from home. This is like the big open question. A lot of people have gone to, second homes. I don't know. I personally don't know anyone yet who's like moved to a real red state, but I certainly hear a lot of people talking about it. I mean, this is a big question.
Yeah, this conversation brings a couple things to mind to me. One of which is, I think about once a month, we ought to ask Texas, Florida, and Tennessee to pay us for organic commercials for moving to their states, like product placement when you see an Audi in your Spider-Man movie. But the other thing is, if I were a savvy right winger and wanted to goad the sort of interstate competition for voters, I think I would commission a projection for the 2030 census, given current trends, and try to convince California and New York that they're in real trouble politically. They could see especially California, you could really see the electoral college behemoth quality of California decline. I mean, percentage wise, yes, it's still going to remain huge, but losing electoral votes to Florida and Texas to a place like California might be a good way to force some real soul searching and improvement of policy. But I'm saying that as James and I both, as the two Californians here left on this podcast.
Yeah, it's for me, the story here is that America is still stubbornly regionalistic, and that even within regions there is still stubborn resistance to being made uniform. Our trad friends like to point out the sorry state of intersections across America that feature one Chevron and one McDonald's and one Burger King and one 76 station. And that's undeniable. But the peculiarities of local people and, cities, suburbs from coast to coast is still formidable. And there is still a great reluctance among the American people to be distilled down to one single human type. I think that is going to continue. And I think that, as mainstream culture continues to fragment, Americans are going to continue on in this great resort in a much more particularistic kind of way. So, more of the same, but so much more that maybe it begins to take on a different character. As Aldous Huxley once said, truly a brave new world.
Well,
I love your
go ahead, Seth.
your miscitations here. It's, following in the
Wait, that was also Shakespeare?
Yeah, that's right.
From The Tempest.
This is
How embarrassing.
Yeah.
God, I shouldn't have a job in media. I don't even know who Shakespeare is.
Faulkner wrote a great book called 1984. You guys,
It's gonna be
exactly.
this will be a comedic leitmotif of the show. Historical literary malapropisms by James. Well, we neglected. I mean, we sort of raised it, but we haven't discussed it directly. COVID is really driving all this, but in particular, it's the interaction, I think, of COVID with incompetent, capricious, arbitrary, and really harmful policies at the state level across these states we're talking about, coupled with their longstanding high cost of living. But I wanted to bring up another COVID thing. We discuss COVID, it seems like every month or so on this show, as it provides interesting reasons to reflect. And James wanted to talk a bit about Melinda Gates, who I don't think this is the first time she brought it up, but I think she brought it up again, James, which is to say, one of the problems with COVID, as with so many other hardships in life these days in our current identity politics environment, is that Melinda Gates says COVID hit women hardest. We're all stuck at home. Women now have to work their job from home and do all the housework. They're stuck with less space because their husband's on top of them at home as well. And then the kids lack childcare in the form of public school. And so this is a crisis for women and for, of course, feminism.
Well, as Shakespeare said, right, these are actually birthing individuals and not women. They could while their children were
that's right.
suckling at their breasts.
People, people with uteruses.
Yeah, exactly. You could just dash your nipple from its boneless gums and dash the brains out, had you so sworn, as Melinda Gates has done to this. That's the easy solution, right? Is just the Lady Macbeth option of murdering your own child.
Well, she certainly seems to be the Lady Macbeth of that relationship with Bill Gates. She is doing her best to eclipse everything that Bill Gates has done and replace it with comments like, even before the pandemic, women did about 3/4 of the unpaid labor at home. Now they've taken on even more cooking, cleaning, and childcare than before. The cost is real, both to women and economies. Unpaid labor is not uncompensated labor. That's number one. Number two, all labor is not the same sort of labor in this laboriousness. I'm just taking the wild guess that many women would rather care for their babies than they would sit in a woke corporation staring at the screen in their cubicle, being allowed 1 hour for lunch to go down to Chipotle and get a burrito and try not to pass out in the office, as running out the clock, hoping that you don't get dragged into another HR meeting. But even beyond that point, the cost to women, it's not clear from this tweet, of course, what the numbers are behind the women, but the claim is that women worldwide need to be treated as a single unit. That the real source of knowledge and wisdom about women's use of their time is to be found in a unit of analysis that is all the women in the world. If you think that is science, I have a Shakespeare quote to sell you.
Well, the sort of neo-Marxian argument, which has now been sort of all over the place for a while, that you, James, just quite thoroughly exploded, right? That's largely at the heart of this. And it does, I mean, you know, and people from Wendell Berry to any number of sort of commentators on the Industrial Revolution have noted this, that the like home economy, which sort of makes the Proverbs wife, right? A good wife who can find that wife is not just like lovely and graceful and beautiful, but she gets up at the crack of dawn and buys a field and like is a businesswoman and sells the extra to feed her family. You know, there is an ancient way in which women's
household
work,
management.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, it's like, oh, a Proverbs wife, if only I could find her with her strong forearms. Like, that is not the image that you typically associate with that passage, but it is. I mean, it's very essential to it. And Xenophon is the kind of Greek analog who talks about in the Economica, right? Like how essential women are to the economy in this highly integrated domestic way, that, you know, men work in the field, women take care of the children, but also, you know, are the distaff, right? Are managing a whole like 50% of this cottage industry. And there is no question that has been sort of steadily eroded and deconstructed by the Industrial Revolution, by woke capital, by any number of things, by first, second, third wave feminism, right? All of these things kind of, you know, you pick at one of those threads and the whole thing comes apart until we're all just these interchangeable units slaving away for however many hours of wage time. And it does seem to me that there is like a huge potential in the pandemic for actually the opposite of what Gates wants. Gates wants us to just lean in, as it were, to that way of calculating things, that just all labor is deserving of a certain sort of financial compensation, and it's not worthwhile. It has no worth or is not recognized as worthwhile unless it receives that kind of compensation. But as we ourselves are currently discovering, right, the pandemic has revealed a whole bunch of other possibilities about working from home, about remote work, which actually make the cottage industry a much more viable thing. And the digital has already been kind of uncovering these possibilities since long before the pandemic. So we're probably, I think, about to see like clash of wills between the Melinda Gates attitude, which just wants like desperate to thrust every development into this one sort of Marxist hyper economic reduction of just what we are, versus the sort of natural efflorescence of a quite exciting new thing, which is some kind of reinvigoration of a more holistic economy in which people do, in fact, measure their worth by more than just dollars and cents. Like, imagine that.
A good point. And, you know, what's funny is you hear a lot about uncompensated labor, but what doesn't seem to make the news is all the compensated non-labor. For instance, like the teachers' unions, which keep demanding that they be rendered completely, you know, harmless and made totally whole. They cannot lose like one penny of their salary or their pensions or their future free health care. Nevertheless, they don't have to do anything until every classroom is completely safe, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you know, I guess one form of uncompensated labor is all of these parents who are having to teach their kids and homeschool them. I mean, I guess if you're going to follow this argument out, then they should be getting, you know, the money should follow the student, and parents should be receiving like massive tax credits for keeping their children at home and teaching them there. I mean, that's not going to happen. But I do like the idea that we could be, you know, opening up the way we conceive of work into a more like holistic or, you know, conservative, essentially home-based view of how things should work, as you just outlined, Spencer.
Yeah, and isn't that like, I mean, this idea of the digital yeoman farmer, you know, the digital homestead is like my preferred phrase for it. I mean, that is very, you know, female friendly. And we've run articles about this. And of course, the response is always, Scott Yenner has a great piece on American Mind about this. And the response is often from those who are prickly, whether they're women or men, about these issues and can only think in terms of the narrative. Oh, well, as soon as you talk about it, if you're just on the right, like, well, you actually don't want women to work at all. And you don't understand that women want to both work and have kids. And it's like, guys, this has been going on for thousands of years, as Spencer points out. And the word economy comes from the idea, of household management in the ancient Greek. I mean, this goes back. This has never been a kind of like all or nothing thing. If you were wealthy, you certainly could have the luxury of maybe not having to work outside the home, but managing the household is a thing. I mean, Camille Paglia talks about, I love it when he talks about her old Italian grandmothers who, like, they weren't concerned about male egos or whatever. They thought men were fragile because they raised them and they were, tyrants within their own domain. But even beyond that, we all know that we're in a situation where women do want to work in various ways, but they also want generally to have children. And a lot of people want some kind of hybrid that makes sense. And I think really what the right can do to move forward is to give honor and respect to that kind of situation. In other words, don't downplay, don't be in a 1950s kind of post World War II mass, box society kind of framework where the only thing that's meaningful when it comes to work is if you go into a big office and you have a corner office and you have a secretary, et cetera, et cetera. No, we're in a totally different environment now where we can actually have a meritocracy and respect people who can come in as an expert or very good at a certain skill, but do it for a short period of time and then go home, right? And not work 80 hours a week. I think a lot of this, when you get outside the politics of it, is actually cultural. We're redefining what actually works and what's actually most productive for a business and the family. But there's a lot of opportunity for the right now, just to grab the bull by the horns and actually respond to what women really want.
Yeah, the vitriol, the anger in the response that you get does sort of speak volumes. And to quote Faulkner, right, that it's protesting too much. And the Wendell Berry.
I mean, Faulkner had a way with the short phrases. He's really good at the quips.
And he was fantastic at iambic pentameter, which is remarkable for somebody of his period. It's strange. But yeah, the Wendell Berry essay that springs to mind. He wrote this actually kind of, I think at the time it made a bit of a splash piece about why wasn't going to buy a computer, and he outlines what I think is a respectable, although ultimately kind of maybe wrong argument about why he won't buy a computer. But he gets these just furious letters. I can't remember if it was in Time or where it was, but just because he mentions that he has a cottage industry with his wife where he writes things by hand and she types them up. And there are, any number of just accusations against him, to which he eventually responded quite eloquently that he was subjugating his wife or enslaving her. And these are unhinged attitudes. I mean, these don't represent reality. They represent ideology and a certain pre-commitment to what women ought to want and what they ought to view as good, which is again, as we've now emphasized several times, right, is not actually to say that there is some strict dichotomy between like men who work and women, the angel in the house, right? This sort of 19th century idea, like that's not it at all. In fact, what we're saying is that like maybe our entire sort of buying into this system where work is something external to us and to our flourishing and our happiness, rather than something kind of internal and integrated into our whole homestead, as you say, Matt, is like maybe that in itself is just it's kind of a Marxian thing, weirdly, in a sort of weird, subverted, conservative way. It's a little bit Marxist to view the world that way.
I do. I mean, don't you? I mean, I do kind of despair on this a little bit, because I do think when you look at what people actually want, there's interesting paths forward, a new form of rhetoric, and actually providing them the opportunity structurally for what they want. But it is true that the propaganda here is very deep. Like the psyop goes very deep for both men and women.
Yeah.
And this idea, I mean, it's implanted in really every woman of a certain age. I think actually as they get younger, they're rejecting it more. But it is like, you are worthless if that's all you do. And all you do is, the more that you're at home, the more you're educating your own children, the more you're in household management, the more that's somehow worthless. And their worth is said to come from really, I mean, you think about it, it's being part of the Borg. It's being part of a large scale corporation that is the girl boss. Like the whole mantra here is coming from big corporate, and it's really perverse. And it's also, of course, it's not just, it's across the board. It's not just for women, but there's a whole, I think, new thing breaking out just because the old modes and orders are so, so calcified and hollow at this point, that I do think there's a silver lining here as well. I'm very positive tonight. I don't know why.
Yeah, you're really, really
I mean, I do think that, look, there's a lot of women who are able to say that, no, I don't respect this system. On the other hand, I have a desire to work in, X, Y, and Z field and do that over time in a different kind of way. I just want that to be honored and have that opportunity in a way that makes sense. And I think right now, I mean, all the institutions everything that was pushing against, this household kind of this digital homestead type mentality, everything was against it in terms of dignity and honor culturally. That's all being devalued. So that is a good thing, right? I mean, the idea of what the school was going to do for your kids being devalued. We see how lame that is, right? The idea that working for big corporate is meaningful or somehow gives you some kind of special, I mean, that's all being devalued every day. So in the midst of this deconstruction, things could get a lot worse. The psyop is deep, but there's some paths forward that are very interesting.
Well, there's two dimensions, I think, to the challenge you identify. And you're right that the indoctrination or the psyop or whatever you want to call it, it goes very, very deep, even into, and this is a feature of really successful, I think, leftist cultural manipulation, right? Like even people who would agree with the critiques that we are articulating here find it difficult to internalize them in their attitudes, their instinctive responses to things, that what they kind of reach for naturally or by second nature. And I notice this all the time in myself, like reactions that I'll have to art where I'm like, oh, isn't that a little racist? And I'm like, no, that's based on a heuristic that is completely not my own. It's just being like insinuated into my bones, essentially. And like that, so that happens, I think, to women with this attitude that like the closer you are to home, the more your value decreases. And there is a certain degree of, to use a phrase now popular on the left, like there's a certain degree of deprogramming of the good sort that you have to do with yourself to like actually believe and act upon what you know to be true. And then there's the fact that these sorts of choices, and the right is maybe sort of bad at recognizing this sometimes, like these sorts of choices occur within a social context, and they cannot simply be made by sheer force of will 100% of the time. Like they require support systems and churches and families, and even, in fact, we might say like, government policies that encourage these sorts of things and make them possible. Which I know we were wanting to talk, I think, about Romney's proposal for a child credit. And
I handle the transitions around here, Spencer.
Sorry?
I said I handle the transitions around here, Spencer.
I'm sorry.
No,
but I felt it was such a good segue. Sorry.
No. We should get. No. We've been going on this for a while, so we should definitely transition.
You can't transition unless you can show us your chest milk.
Shut it down.
No. Nobody Google what James means by that. It's the latest evolution in our weird identity politics. But yeah, we did want to talk about what Romney's calling the Family Security Act. So let's just set the scene a bit. I mean, our pro-Trump listeners especially will have reason to be disappointed in Romney in recent years, and disappointed in his predictable establishmentarian approach to the Trump phenomenon. We should add, of course, only after he had dinner with Trump to see if he might be Secretary of State. But moving on from that, he has this proposal which would called the Family Security Act, and it would do the following, just the broad outlines. So he's finally done something interesting in my book. Romney has, given the last few years of pretty predictable establishmentarian conduct. His plan, it offers, this is from the New York Post, our friend Gladden Pappin is praising it. So I'm just quoting here. His plan offers parents of children age 5 and under $350 per month, declining to $250 per month between the ages of 6 and 17. And for a family of 3 children under 5, that amounts to a hefty benefit of $12,600 a year. And it's not in the form of a complicated tax credit, as Gladden puts it. It's it is a direct monthly payment, which helps people budget. It's a mini version, a much scaled down version of the pretty aggressive pro-family cash payment policies or even tax forgivable policies that a place like Viktor Orban's Hungary has been pursuing. This question of demographic decline in the West, the collapse of birth rates, and everything else, it looms large for the future of the West, at least as it's currently known, absent massive immigration from other parts of the world. So this is an interesting proposal. For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with this stuff, I want to bring up the dirtbag left for this following interesting reason. We've been talking a bit about economic incentives and the commercialization of female work over the last half century. There's this interesting phenomenon or convergence between the kind of pro-family trad right and the neo-Marxist left. And the latest example was just a few weeks ago, or not a few weeks ago, I think it was last week, on the Red Scare podcast, which is run by two Marxists, one an actress and one a kind of, as she calls herself, a self-described art critic and art thought. Don't Google thought either, or chest milk. Anna Khachiyan. They praised Romney's plan, especially in contrast to what they saw as the Biden administration's retrenchment on COVID relief. And so you have this very odd phenomenon of the traditionalist right. Gladden Papin, who I mentioned, who's praising Romney's plan, is certainly in that sort of Catholic traditionalist right vein, has been arguing for this sort of policy initiative for the last few years. And then you have the Marxist left in the form of two women, I think both unmarried at this point, but who nonetheless think that the bill of goods sold to feminists on the left over the last half century was just that it was all kind of as they would call it, a neoliberal ploy to get them into the workplace. So you have this very odd phenomenon of a couple of Marxist women, one who lives in LA, one who lives in New York, praising Mitt Romney of all people. It just shows the odd convergences of our current politics, and is worth paying attention to and thinking about.
Well, I mean, to me, from Romney's perspective, it's clear he's doing a couple of things. One, I mean, this is just pure pork barrel politics. Yeah. I mean, he's, it's just welfare for Mormons. I mean, there's, his constituents do tend to have a lot of children, so this would be great for them. I mean, second, I guess he's positioning himself to run for president again as a new kind of, this new Republican Party that dispenses with, just turn the money machine on, but in this family friendly way. But I mean, the problem with this policy, I mean, look, it would be great. Sure. Why not? But is it really, it's not pro-family in any sense that we would think of pro-family. I mean, you have a country where I don't know if it's 50% or not, but certainly a huge proportion of babies are born to single mothers, and their outcomes, societal outcomes are, it's well established that their outcomes are poor. It's not an ideal way to have children or to, design a society. So this would just incentivize more of that. And I can't see this as in any way a real positive.
Yeah, the true Hungarian way, Seth, would be to require you to be married for you to get the benefit. But of course, someone like Romney would never advocate such a thing, and I'd probably get thrown out of court in a heartbeat, or thrown out by a court in a heartbeat anyway.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't begrudge anyone's need for a couple more $1,000 in order to pay the bills. We've all probably been there at some point in our lives. But it does seem that as the dollar becomes increasingly magical money with no connection to anything of intrinsic value, and with more fiat dollars coming every day, it does appear that the dollar is turning into something like a symbol of honor which is bestowed upon people who we think deserve more honors relative to others, or more honors than they've gotten so far, or just enough honors to maybe like make us feel like we don't really need to do anything else for their benefit. And the morphing of our economic policy into what seems like a more honor-based framework, designed and concerned mainly with just, sort of holding up different groups for public favor, and a favor into which everyone in some abstract sense must buy, considering that they are all taxpayers, except many people, of course, are not taxpayers. That seems important, and it seems like something that's only going to intensify, at least so long as our current kind of fiscal policy can be maintained.
So, James, you'd give them $500 worth of Bitcoin every month, right? Is that what you're saying?
This is a great question. Like there is a strain of tech boosterism. This was splashed on one of Apple's pages or another. I can't remember which right now. It's sort of an introduction to Bitcoin with the motto in that sort of classic sans serif font of Apple's, "This changes everything." And, you can just hear like the excitement among people who feel like, oh my God, what if like our idea of progress has actually painted us into a corner of like stagnation and minimalism and decline. And yet finally, there's at least one more thing that promises to change everything. Oh my God, we're saved. There is that kind of like demented eschatological view of Bitcoin, which is, just when you thought that we'd wrung every last drop of innovation and excitement out of the economy, now we can do it all over again because there's this new toy for us to all play with. But that, of course, is not the only way to look at Bitcoin or hopefully any currency or potential currency. Just as, America is stubbornly particularistic, despite the fact that most Americans want to remain Americans. I think that currency is going to continue to fragment into smaller competing mini currencies. Even if the international financiers or Wall Street really get their teeth into Bitcoin and turn it into just one more investment within their system, within their walled garden, I still think that it's just going to be very hard to stop these other rival currencies from growing and becoming objects of fascination.
Hey, can we just say? I mean, we should just say, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't know if James is right about that. That seems crazy. I mean, there's still a lot of people who will look at the stuff that we say and say, "This is nuts. Cryptocurrency. What is that?" A lot of good friends of mine too. Many of whom are older, but who are good, intelligent, belligerent people who are fighting for the good, and they just don't take it seriously. I would just say, you don't have to. The intellectual argument, I don't care. People are taking it seriously, so you need to investigate it and explore some of these questions, because we are in a very turbulent transitional time, and if you don't believe what James is saying, okay, that's fine, but you owe it to yourself to really consider why so many people are taking cryptocurrency seriously. And, I think there's a lot of people who are just behind because you can kind of still at a cocktail party say, oh, this isn't real. Unlike the dollar, money printer go brr. Everything's fine with the dollar. I mean, there's some crazy things going on that are just factual. And at the very least, you need to consider this an open question. I wanted to say something radical about the woman question. I'm thinking about tweeting this, but I don't really want to deal with the aftermath. It's so funny, like the idea that, of what marriage is, and sex in marriage, and this idea that there was this prudish time where women were oppressed, et cetera, yada yada. What cracks me up in all these discussions is there used to be this phrase, and correct me if I'm insane, but I believe Shakespeare or Faulkner or one of those guys used it. But when the idea was that a rake, a bad guy who just want to sleep around and screw as many women as possible, the problem is he dishonored women. I mean, the word was to dishonor a woman. Why? Why was that? This is so woke. This is so deep cut. You can't even say this without heads exploding like mushroom clouds of red Tom Clancy mist exploding in people's heads. If you even put this concept out loud today, you say it. But the idea was that, if you had sexual intercourse with a woman, you had dishonored her because you engaged in something that could lead to childbirth, right? Without the commitment of marriage, thereby putting her in a vulnerable position in which she would have no partner, right, and have to raise the children on her own. This used to be so commonsensical that everyone understood it. They've memed they've memed and psyoped the world into thinking, oh well, that's actually very misogynistic, and it's misogynistic if you say that all these women who now have to work and take care of their kids, right, are in a bad way. Actually, they're very empowered, and how dare you, sir? How dare you dishonor them by suggesting, right? And so there's something that goes very deep here, and there's a conversation that just needs to happen out in the open more, where I think we've gotten to we've reduced this to the absurd. And when it comes to the working bit, the fulfilling life is having children. In many cases, if you look at surveys of what women want, even those today who've been who are modern, what modern women actually want, right? And you see that they want to have children, and they also want to be able to work, but they will let the children take precedence. They want easy access to that kind of household management and work. And I don't think that we're going to resolve this problem without having some uncomfortable discussions, that go right to the heart of these head exploding concepts that come from the oh so distant past of what your grandmother or great grandmother thought was common sense.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, you're right, Seth. The prospect of Romney's proposed plan reviving somehow demographic vitality in the United States is pretty dim. I'd say, though, the most we could say for it, just at a cursory glance, and I haven't really investigated it in great depth, I just wanted to flag it, and is that he's continuing to open this conversation on the right, and from a man in his, at least his sort of establishmentarian position, it's pretty interesting. Interesting for the political moment we're in, and where he and like a Senator Rubio may disagree on their opportunistic or sincerely held beliefs about Trump. I leave that determination to our listeners. Over the last few years, it's clear that there's really no going back in a way to a pre-Trump Republican Party. And it'll be interesting to see how these ambitious and intelligent politicians try to sort all that out. And we should keep in mind, too, that just the crass politically interested reasons why this sort of thing is attractive. First and foremost, large families in Utah. After all, politics is about doing well for your constituents, among other things. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. Well, we've run a little over, and we started a little late, so we'll let our East Coasters retire, and the rest of us can get home. Thank you all once again for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate, and please visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate, review us well, and share and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Jay Gannon and Annalisa Lee, our production and engineering crew, and thank you to you all. Talk to you next week.
Can we just discuss what a shenanigan is? I'm still not.
The etymology of shenanigan.
My mommy and daddy never told me about shenanigans.
The shenanigans.
It's from German I think. Scheinigelei, peddler's argot for work craft, or the related German slang verb schnägeln.
It's not even Irish.
It's not it. You're right. That's Flanagan, I think.